Clean that up, sweetheart. Some of us are trying to build real things. The laugh came right after, smooth and easy, the kind that didn't need to be loud to make a whole room feel smaller. Naomi Carter kept her eyes on the dark splash of coffee spreading across the white marble like a stain trying to claim the whole floor. The lobby of Holloway Tower gleamed around her, all glass and brass and cold morning light, 30 feet of windows catching the pale Manhattan sun and throwing it back in silver sheets. Men in tailored suits crossed the space with leather briefcases and steaming paper cups, their shoes clicking in sharp little bursts that echoed off stone and steel. Naomi knelt beside the spill with a folded rag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, the scent of lemon cleaner rising faintly through the richer smells of roasted coffee and expensive cologne. She had been on shift since 5:30 a.m. Her lower back ached, her fingers were dry from chemicals, and the skin at the base of her thumb had started to crack from winter air and cleaning fluid. But she moved with the quiet precision of someone who knew that one wrong look, one slow response, 1 ounce of visible pride in the wrong moment could cost her the paycheck that kept the lights on in her mother's apartment in Newark. The man standing over her was Richard Holloway, owner of the building, owner of half the block if the gossip was true, a billionaire with silver at his temples and a navy overcoat that looked like it cost more than her rent for 6 months. He checked his watch as if the spilled coffee had inconvenienced history itself. 2 junior executives beside him let out thin, obedient chuckles. Naomi could feel them trying not to stare directly at her, which somehow felt worse. Invisible was one thing. Publicly invisible was another. Holloway tipped the empty cup toward a trash can without looking and missed by nearly a foot. "You people always move slow when somebody important is waiting," he said, his tone light enough to pass for humor if you didn't look at his eyes. Naomi reached forward and pressed the rag into the edge of the spill, watching the brown liquid soak into white cotton. Her reflection wavered in the marble beneath her hand. For a second, all she could see was the cuff of her gray cleaning uniform and the cheap rubber sole of her work shoe, blurred beneath the smear. Around her, the lobby seemed to hold its breath. A receptionist behind the black stone desk stopped typing. A security guard near the revolving doors shifted his weight, but said nothing. Somewhere above them, an elevator chimed. Naomi heard every small sound at once. The hum of the overhead lights, the hiss of the lobby heater, the faint swish of the revolving door turning against the morning cold. Holloway gave a short laugh and leaned just enough for her to catch his reflection too. Tall and clean and untouched by effort. "That's all right," he added, glancing at the executives with a smile that didn't reach his face. "Everybody's got a ceiling." One of the men laughed harder this time. Naomi's hand tightened around the rag. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for the tendons in her wrist to pull. She had heard versions of this her whole life, in different rooms, in different clothes, from teachers who thought they were being practical, from landlords who said she was articulate like it was a surprise, from hiring managers who saw her skin before they saw her resume, from strangers who looked at a black woman with a mop and decided that was the whole story. But something about the way Holloway said it, right there in the center of his cathedral of money, with the marble shining under both of them like polished ice, made the words land deeper than usual. She finished wiping the spill in one smooth motion, then sprayed the last shadow of it, and buffed the stone until it gleamed again. Only then did she stand. She wasn't tall, but she had a stillness about her that sometimes made people straighten without knowing why. She lifted her chin and met Richard Holloway's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was calm and low, soft enough that the men closest to her had to stop smiling to hear it. "Maybe," she said, folding the rag with careful hands. "But ceilings can become floors when you learn how buildings are made." For the first time that morning, the lobby went completely silent. "Clean that up, sweetheart. Some of us are trying to build real things." The laugh came. Right after, smooth and easy, the kind that didn't need to be loud to make a whole room feel smaller. Naomi Carter kept her eyes on the dark splash of coffee spreading across the white marble like a stain trying to claim the whole floor. The lobby of Holloway Tower gleamed around her, all glass and brass and cold morning light, 30 feet of windows catching the pale Manhattan sun and throwing it back in silver sheets. Men in tailored suits crossed the space with leather briefcases and steaming paper cups, their shoes clicking in sharp little bursts that echoed off stone and steel. Naomi knelt beside the spill with a folded rag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, the scent of lemon cleaner rising faintly through the richer smells of roasted coffee and expensive cologne. She had been on shift since 5:30 a.m. Her lower back ached, her fingers were dry from chemicals, and the skin at the base of her thumb had started to crack from winter air and cleaning fluid. But she moved with the quiet precision of someone who knew that one wrong look, one slow response, 1 ounce of visible pride in the wrong moment could cost her the paycheck that kept the lights on in her mother's apartment in Newark. The man standing over her was Richard Holloway, owner of the building, owner of half the block if the gossip was true, a billionaire with silver at his temples and a navy overcoat that looked like it cost more than her rent for 6 months. He checked his watch as if the spilled coffee had inconvenienced history itself. 2 junior executives beside him let out thin, obedient chuckles. Naomi could feel them trying not to stare directly at her, which somehow felt worse. Invisible was one thing. Publicly invisible was another. Holloway tipped the empty cup toward a trash can without looking and missed by nearly a foot. "You people always move slow when somebody important is waiting," he said, his tone light enough to pass for humor if you didn't look at his eyes. Naomi reached forward and pressed the rag into the edge of the spill, watching the brown liquid soak into white cotton. Her reflection wavered in the marble beneath her hand. For a second, all she could see was the cuff of her gray cleaning uniform, and the cheap rubber sole of her work shoe, blurred beneath the smear. Around her, the lobby seemed to hold its breath. A receptionist behind the black stone desk stopped typing. A security guard near the revolving doors shifted his weight, but said nothing. Somewhere above them, an elevator chimed. Naomi heard every small sound at once. The hum of the overhead lights, the hiss of the lobby heater, the faint swish of the revolving door turning against the morning cold. Holloway gave a short laugh and leaned just enough for her to catch his reflection too, tall and clean and untouched by effort. "That's all right," he added, glancing at the executives with a smile that didn't reach his face. "Everybody's got a ceiling." One of the men laughed harder this time. Naomi's hand tightened around the rag. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for the tendons in her wrist to pull. She had heard versions of this her whole life, in different rooms, in different clothes, from teachers who thought they were being practical, from landlords who said she was articulate like it was a surprise, from hiring managers who saw her skin before they saw her resume, from strangers who looked at a black woman with a mop and decided that was the whole story. But something about the way Holloway said it, right there in the center of his cathedral of money, with the marble shining under both of them like polished ice, made the words land deeper than usual. She finished wiping the spill in one smooth motion, then sprayed the last shadow of it, and buffed the stone until it gleamed again. Only then did she stand. She wasn't tall, but she had a stillness about her that sometimes made people straighten without knowing why. She lifted her chin and met Richard Holloway's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was calm and low, soft enough that the men closest to her had to stop smiling to hear it. "Maybe," she said, folding the rag with careful hands. "But ceilings can become floors when you learn how buildings are made." For the first time that morning, the lobby went completely silent. The service elevator smelled like metal, bleach, and yesterday's rain trapped in wool coats. Naomi stood inside with her cleaning cart and watched the brushed steel doors shiver shut, sealing off the polished quiet of the lobby from the dim back corridors that fed the rest of the building like hidden veins. The fluorescent light above her buzzed with a tired, uneven hum, making everything look flatter than it was. Her gray uniform, her dark brown skin, the blue rubber gloves tucked into the side pocket of her cart, the yellow caution sign hooked over the handle, all of it reflected in the dull wall panels in warped fragments. As the elevator began its slow climb toward the 22nd floor, she let out a breath she had been holding since the lobby. It left her quietly, but not weakly, more like steam easing out of a pipe under pressure. The words from downstairs still lingered in the air around her, not just his, but hers too. They felt dangerous now that the moment had passed. Sharp things often did. Naomi rested one hand on the cart and flexed the other. The skin across her knuckles was dry and pale with soap. A tiny cut near her thumb stung where the lemon cleaner had found it earlier. She thought of her mother's medicine lined up on the kitchen counter in Newark, amber bottles and white caps, all arranged by time of day, because some evenings her hands shook too badly to sort them. She thought of the electric bill folded under a magnet on the refrigerator. She thought of the envelope from Essex County College sitting unopened on the table for 3 days, because hope could feel expensive when rent was due. By the time the elevator opened, the part of her that felt anything too openly had already gone back behind its usual walls. On the 22nd floor, the hallway was empty except for the faint smell of copier toner and fresh paint near the leasing office. The carpet here muffled everything. Even her cart wheels rolled softer, as though the building wanted to keep its wealth from sounding ordinary. She passed framed black and white photographs of the tower under construction, steel beams and hard hats, and men grinning on skeletons of future floors. No women. No one who looked like her. Just history arranged on cream-colored walls, as if success had always worn the same face. Naomi unlocked the janitor closet at the end of the corridor and stepped into the narrow room lined with shelves of paper products, spray, bottles, and gallon jugs of cleaner with printed hazard labels. Her lunch bag sat on the top shelf beside an old pocket radio and a cracked mug someone had written "World's Best Boss" on years ago, as a joke no one remembered anymore. She took off her gloves, washed her hands in the utility sink, and stared for a second at the cold water running over her fingers. The pipes knocked faintly behind the wall. There was comfort in that sound. Honest things always made noise when they were working. "Girl, what did you say to him?" The voice came from the doorway before Naomi turned. It was Laverne Brooks from housekeeping, 52, sharp-eyed, always carrying peppermint in her pocket and more building gossip than the front desk and security combined. She stood with a stack of folded microfiber cloths against one hip, her eyebrows lifted high enough to say she already knew half the story and wanted the other half confirmed. Naomi reached for a paper towel and dried her hands slowly. "Nothing I could take back," she said. Laverne clicked her tongue and stepped inside, lowering her voice even though no one was near. "Baby, that man gets people reassigned for less than a bad morning." Naomi gave a small nod. "I know. Then why do it?" Naomi looked toward the half-open closet door, out into the clean, silent hallway with its framed history and locked offices and expensive quiet. Her answer came after a second, not because she had to think of it, but because saying true things out loud still required a kind of courage. "Because I am tired of acting like I do not hear what I hear." Laverne studied her face for a long moment, then reached into her pocket, unwrapped a peppermint, and set it on the shelf beside Naomi's lunch bag. "That kind of tired will either break you," she said softly, "or build something in you nobody can touch." Then she headed back into the corridor, cloths balanced against her hip, her sensible shoes whispering over carpet. Naomi stood alone again in the supply closet, the peppermint bright red against the faded brown paper of her lunch bag. Outside, phones rang softly behind office doors. A printer started up somewhere down the hall. The building kept moving, as if none of the morning had mattered, as if the words spoken in marble and brass had already dissolved into the air. But Naomi knew better. Buildings remembered, not in the way people did, with forgiveness or spite. They remembered through scuffs, through repairs, through who got keys and who never did, through names on directories and names left off plaques. She picked up the peppermint, turned it once in her fingers, then slipped it into her pocket. After that she reached up to the top shelf and touched the unopened college envelope, just lightly, like she was checking whether it was still real. At 11:40 that morning, the call came through the beige wall phone in the janitor closet, sharp and sudden enough to make Naomi look up from the stack of paper towel cases she was breaking down for recycling. She wiped her hands on her uniform and picked up on the second ring. "Maintenance," she said. A pause. Then the voice of Sandra Lee from executive reception, clipped and perfectly neutral in the way polished office voices often were when they were delivering something unpleasant. "Mr. Holloway would like the 39th floor conference corridor refreshed before noon." Immediately, Naomi glanced at the old clock above the sink. 20 minutes. "I am on 22, she said. "Then I would move quickly," Sandra replied, and the line went dead. Naomi stood still for half a second, the receiver warm in her hand, then set it back in place with more care than the moment deserved. Laverne, who had been replacing trash liners near the opposite shelf, gave her a look without asking. Naomi answered it anyway. 39. Laverne shook her head once, slow and knowing. "That is not about the hallway." Naomi already knew that. The 39th floor was not on her normal rotation. That floor held the executive boardroom, investor suites, and a private lounge with smoked glass walls and cream carpet. Nobody on maintenance was allowed to enter unless someone important had made a mess first. She loaded fresh cloths, a stainless steel polish, glass cleaner, and a replacement liner bag onto her cart, then took the service elevator up alone. The higher floors felt different, even in the back corridors. The air was colder. The walls were quieter. Money did that. It softened noise for the people who could afford not to hear it. When the elevator opened, she stepped into a hallway lined with dark walnut panels and recessed lighting that glowed like late afternoon, even though it was still before lunch. The carpet here was thick enough to hide footsteps. At the far end, a pair of bronze doors stood open to a conference room where low voices moved in and out like a tide. Sandra Lee waited outside with a tablet against her chest and a silk blouse the color of wet sand. Her face was professional, composed, unreadable except for the tightness around her mouth. "This way," she said, without greeting. Naomi followed her past a glass wall that looked out over Midtown, all rooftops and water towers, and the pale winter sky stretched flat across Manhattan. Inside the corridor, two assistants stood near a sideboard adjusting bottled water and leather folders. Both glanced at Naomi, then away too quickly. Sandra stopped near a brass planter that did not need attention and lowered her voice. "The floor is fine," she said. "He asked for you specifically." Naomi set one hand on the handle of her cart. "Why?" Sandra's eyes flicked toward the open conference room. "I do not ask Mr. Holloway why." For a second the only sound was the faint clink of ice in a glass from somewhere inside the lounge, and the soft murmur of men discussing square footage, market pressure, long-term debt. Language from high places always sounded cleaner than what it did to people. Naomi reached for her spray bottle and cloth anyway, because sometimes dignity looked like preparation. Sandra studied her for a brief moment, as if deciding whether to say more. Finally she did. "He does not like being surprised in his own building." Naomi gave the smallest nod. "Neither do I." Sandra blinked once, then stepped back just as Richard Holloway emerged from the conference room. In daylight from the windows, he looked even more carefully assembled than he had in the lobby. Silver tie, dark suit, cuff links with a muted shine, every detail pressed into place by habit and money. But there was something else now too, something faint and brittle beneath the polish, like glass under too much heat. Two board members came out behind him, both in their 60s, both carrying thick packets of financial projections. Holloway said something low to them, and they moved off toward the elevators, leaving him in the corridor with Naomi, Sandra, and the long silence that followed. He slipped one hand into his coat pocket and looked at her not as a person exactly, but as a disruption he intended to measure. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth again, restored for private use. Naomi noticed that he knew her name now. That landed harder than if he had forgotten it. "Sir." His gaze moved briefly to the cart, the cloths, the spray bottle, all the visible signs of what he believed her place to be. Then back to her face. "I have spent 30 years turning this property into a symbol of excellence," he said. "People come through these doors because they trust what they see." Naomi waited. Holloway took another step closer, close enough for her to catch the clean cedar scent of his cologne under the colder smell of central air. "What happened downstairs this morning," he said, "does not happen again." It was not a threat spoken loudly. That would have been easier. It was quieter than that. Older. More practiced. The kind of sentence built from generations of men who never had to raise their voices because entire systems had always leaned in when they spoke. Naomi kept her hand still on the cart handle. Beyond him, the city glittered through the glass, millions of lives moving under windows that did not open. "You mean the coffee spill," she said softly. "Or the part where I answered you?" For the first time, the polished calm around Richard Holloway thinned enough for Naomi to see what lay under it. Not rage. Something colder. The deep offense of a man who had spent most of his life mistaking control for order. And in that moment, standing in the corridor above a city he believed he had mastered, Richard Holloway looked less like a king than like a man hearing an unfamiliar sound in the walls of his own house. Richard Holloway did not answer right away. He just stood there with one hand in his coat pocket and the other resting loosely at his side, as if silence itself were another executive instrument he knew how to use better than anyone else. The corridor lights cast a pale shine along the edge of his jaw and silvered the glass wall behind him. Naomi could see the city reflected faintly over his shoulder, all those offices and windows stacked into the winter sky, each one holding people who would never know this moment existed. Inside the conference room, someone laughed at something too far away to matter. A chair scraped softly against the floor. The smell of dark roast coffee drifted through the doorway, warm and rich and faintly bitter. Holloway tilted his head just enough to suggest patience wearing thin. "What I mean," he said at last, "is that there are positions in this building, and there are lines. People tend to do better here when they remember both." The words landed with that same polished calm. No raised voice, no open insult, just a sentence built to place her back where he believed she belonged. Naomi felt the chill from the vent above move across the back of her neck. Sandra Lee had already stepped away, pretending to review something on her tablet several yards down the corridor, close enough to hear every word and far enough to survive denying it. Naomi looked past Holloway for a moment at the sideboard near the conference room entrance. Crystal water glasses, linen napkins folded with exact corners, leather folders arranged in a neat stack. Someone had polished the brass trim that morning until it gleamed like a promise. Buildings like this were full of surfaces designed to reflect value. Very few reflected truth. "I remember my position every day," Naomi said. Her voice stayed even, but there was steel in the center of it now, thin and clean. "That is how I know the difference between work and disrespect." Holloway's eyes hardened a fraction. It was the smallest shift, almost elegant in how contained it was, but Naomi caught it. Men like him spent years practicing the appearance of self-control because self-control looked good in annual reports and magazine profiles. "Respect," he said, "is earned." Naomi met his gaze. "So is authority." For 1 suspended second, neither of them moved. The hum of the ventilation system seemed louder. Somewhere down the hall an elevator chimed, and the bronze doors whispered open, then shut again. Holloway took his hand from his pocket and adjusted the sleeve of his coat, a small immaculate gesture that told Naomi he was reaching for composure the way other people reach for railings. "You are very articulate, Miss Carter." There it was. Smooth. Familiar. A sentence she had heard in classrooms, interviews, offices, hospital waiting rooms, always delivered like a compliment and always carrying the same quiet poison underneath. Surprise. He had expected submission from a black woman in a gray cleaning uniform and found language instead. Naomi did not let the sting show on her face. "Thank you," she said softly. "You are exactly as observant as people say." Something flickered in Sandra's expression down the hall, so fast it might have been nothing. Holloway gave a single humorless breath through his nose. Then he stepped slightly aside and nodded toward the brass planter that had brought her there under a false pretense. "You may finish whatever it is you were asked to do." Naomi understood the dismissal for what it was. Not victory. Not defeat. A temporary retreat by a man unwilling to make a scene where witnesses wore cuff links. She reached for the stainless steel polish and a clean cloth, then bent to wipe a fingerprint from the edge of the planter that had likely been invisible to everyone until he needed an excuse to summon her. The metal cooled her fingertips through the rag. Holloway did not leave immediately. She could feel him standing there, watching in the way powerful men sometimes watched labor when they needed reassurance that the world still arranged itself correctly beneath them. After a moment he said, "People with ambition often mistake proximity for access." Naomi continued polishing until she could see a blurred version of herself in the brass. "And people with power," she replied, "sometimes mistake habit for permanence." That did it. Not outwardly. His posture stayed controlled, his face still assembled into wealth and discipline, but something behind his eyes closed with a decisive click. The kind of look people gave elevators that no longer responded to their keycards. "Be careful," he said quietly. Naomi straightened and folded the cloth in half. "I am," she answered. Holloway held her gaze for one final beat, then turned and walked back into the conference room without another word. The door eased shut behind him, sealing in the low murmur of money, forecasts, and men discussing square feet as if lives were a footnote. Naomi stood alone in the corridor with the brass planter shining under recessed light and the faint smell of polished wood all around her. Her pulse was steady now, not because she was safe, because she understood something clearly for the first time. Richard Holloway had wanted the moment downstairs erased. Instead, he had done something more dangerous than remember her face. He had begun to notice her. By the time Naomi clocked out, the sky over Manhattan had turned the color of worn aluminum. The last of the afternoon light clung to the edges of the buildings across 6th Avenue, cold and thin, while the lobby inside Holloway Tower glowed with the expensive warmth of recessed lighting and polished stone. She signed her initials on the maintenance sheet in the basement office, slid the pen back across the scarred metal desk, and pulled her coat from the hook by the door. It was dark brown, older than she liked to admit, the lining gone smooth at the cuffs, but clean and carefully brushed. She wrapped her scarf twice around her neck, tucked her college envelope deeper into her tote bag, and stepped out through the employee exit into air that smelled like bus exhaust, street pretzels, and the coming snow. The city hit her all at once the way it always did after a shift in a sealed building. The horns, the crosswalk signals, the conversations spilling from people in motion, all of it louder because she had spent 12 hours swallowing her own voice. She walked east to Port Authority with her shoulders square and her tote pressed against her side, passing windows filled with watches, shoes, and winter coats worth more than a month of her pay. In one glass reflection, she caught sight of herself between mannequins, a tired black woman in practical shoes carrying a bag with a frayed strap. And for half a step she saw exactly what men like Richard Holloway saw when they looked at her. Then the crowd shifted, the image broke, and she kept walking. The bus ride to Newark was packed and overheated, the windows fogged from damp coats and human breath. Naomi stood for the first 12 minutes because every seat was taken, one hand wrapped around the metal pole, the other holding her tote high enough to keep it from brushing the wet floor. A toddler somewhere near the back was fussing. Somebody's headphones leaked a tinny drumbeat. A tired nurse in blue scrubs slept sitting up with her chin on her chest and one hand still around her lunch cooler. Naomi looked at all of them and felt the familiar ache that came from understanding what invisible really meant in a city like this. It did not mean nobody saw you. It meant they saw you and decided your exhaustion was ordinary. By the time she reached her stop on Springfield Avenue, the air had turned sharper. She walked the last 4 blocks past a corner store with flickering neon in the window and a church whose front steps still held patches of old gray snow. Her apartment building was brick, 5 stories, built before anybody thought hallways should smell pleasant. The heat pipes knocked inside the walls like distant footsteps. Upstairs, apartment 4C carried the scent of onions, laundry detergent, and the eucalyptus rub her mother used when her chest got tight. Naomi unlocked the door and stepped into the small living room where the lamp by the sofa cast a soft amber pool over crocheted armrests and neatly stacked mail. Her mother, Lorraine Carter, sat under a blanket in her recliner with reading glasses low on her nose and a grocery coupon circular folded in her lap. Even tired, she held herself with a kind of grace Naomi had never been able to explain to people who thought dignity came from money. "You are late," Lorraine said, not accusing, just noticing. Naomi kissed her forehead and set down her bag. "Big day at the palace." Lorraine looked up over the rim of her glasses. "Trouble?" Naomi moved into the kitchenette and set a pot on the stove. The burner clicked, then caught. Not the kind that pays over time. Her mother made a soft sound that might have been amusement, might have been concern. In their apartment, those two often sounded alike. Naomi filled the kettle, then reached automatically to line up the medication bottles for the evening. White cap, blue cap, one with food, one without. Her hands knew the order even when her mind was elsewhere. "You ate?" she asked. "Half a bowl of soup. The other half is pretending to be tomorrow's lunch." Naomi smiled faintly and opened the small refrigerator. There was leftover rice, collard greens from Sunday, 2 eggs, milk close to its date, and the soup in a plastic container with her mother's careful handwriting on masking tape. Familiar scarcity. Organized. Managed. Endured. She warmed the soup, sliced bread, and listened as the radiator hissed beside the window. Outside, a siren moved somewhere far off, then faded. Inside, the apartment felt held together by routines so ordinary they could almost pass for peace. Lorraine watched her daughter for a moment, the way mothers do when they can tell a wound has not yet decided whether it will become anger or fuel. "Naomi," she said gently, "what happened?" Naomi stood still with the spoon in her hand. The image came back too easily. Marble floor, coffee stain, silver cuff links. That laugh made for other people to hear. Then another image followed it, the one she had not expected to matter as much. Richard Holloway speaking to her on the 39th floor, as if lines drawn by men like him were laws of nature. She set the spoon down and turned off the flame. "A man looked right at me today," she said quietly, "and still could not imagine I belonged in the future." Lorraine was silent for a beat, then reached to the side table and tapped the unopened college envelope sticking out of Naomi's tote. "Then maybe," she said, her voice low and steady, "the future is where you answer him." Naomi looked at the envelope, cream-colored, official, almost too clean for their worn kitchen table. Outside the window, snow began to fall in fine dry flakes, catching the streetlight in little flashes before disappearing into the dark. Naomi opened the envelope after her mother went to bed. The apartment had settled into its nighttime sounds by then, the soft rattle of the radiator, the refrigerator motor kicking on and off, the occasional sweep of tires through slush outside on Springfield Avenue. She sat at the kitchen table under the yellow light above the stove with a mug of tea cooling beside her, and slid one finger carefully beneath the flap as if the paper might tear more than itself open. Inside was a letter from Essex County College confirming her acceptance into the evening certificate program in property management and business administration. 2 nights a week in person, 1 night online, 12 months if taken straight through, longer if life interrupted, which Naomi knew it always tried to do. She read the page once, then again, taking in each line slowly. Tuition due dates, textbook estimates, class hours, building operations, lease structures, accounting basics, commercial systems. Words that looked dry on paper and felt electric in her chest. At the bottom was a note, reminding students that limited scholarship assistance remained available on a first-come, first-served basis. Naomi let the page rest on the table and stared at it while steam faded from her tea. In the next room her mother coughed once, then settled. Naomi reached for the second sheet, the one listing total cost, and there it was, the number that turned possibility into a problem you could measure. She got up, crossed to the counter, and pulled a notepad from the junk drawer beside a rubber band ball, old takeout menus, and spare batteries. Then she sat again and began doing what she had always done when life tried to make her choose between need and hope. She calculated rent, utilities, medicine, bus fare, groceries, the small payment she sent every month to help her younger brother Terrence keep his textbooks covered at Rutgers, then wages, current hours, tax taken out, overtime if she picked up weekend rotation in another building. She worked the numbers until the tea went cold and the digits filled half the page in neat, careful rows. It was not impossible. That was the surprise. It was tight enough to hurt, narrow enough to leave no room for shoes that were not practical or sleep that was not earned, but it was not impossible. Naomi leaned back in the chair and listened to the pipes knock in the wall. Snow tapped lightly against the window over the sink. On the table, the acceptance letter caught the warm light and glowed against the scratched wood like something almost holy. The next morning began at 4:45 with the alarm on her second-hand clock radio, buzzing against the crate beside her bed. Naomi shut it off before it could wake her mother and sat up in the cold dark room for one breath, then another. Her uniform hung pressed on the closet door. Her practical black shoes waited beneath it. She washed, dressed, packed a peanut butter sandwich, and slipped the college letter into a folder before placing it at the bottom of her tote bag. The bus into Manhattan was half full with the city's first shift of invisible people, cooks, home health aides, porters, nursing assistants, men carrying tool belts, women with tired eyes and travel mugs held like promises. Naomi stood near the back and watched the sky pale over the turnpike, all steel blue and bruised. Silver. She reached Holloway Tower before sunrise, when the lobby looked its most honest. Empty, quiet, all that polished grandeur without the performance of being admired. The marble still held the chill of the night. The brass rails caught the first weak light from outside. Naomi signed in, tied on her apron, and began her route with a calm she did not fully trust yet. Something in her had shifted at the kitchen table. Not confidence exactly, more like direction. Around 8:10, while she was restocking hand soap in the women's restroom on the 18th floor, her supervisor, Daniel Pierce, found her. Daniel was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, a man who spoke little and noticed more than people gave him credit for. He had worked in commercial buildings for nearly 4 decades and carried his ring of keys with the quiet gravity of someone who understood that systems only looked seamless because other people kept them from falling apart. He stood in the doorway with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You have a minute?" Naomi straightened from the sink and nodded. Daniel glanced down the hallway before stepping inside. "Word travels fast in this building," he said. His voice was low, roughened by age and coffee. Naomi waited. Daniel looked at her for a second, not with pity and not with warning, but with something steadier. "You did not say anything wrong yesterday." Naomi blinked once. Praise was rare in buildings like this. Honest praise was rarer. "That does not mean it was wise," Daniel added. "But wrong and unwise are not the same thing." He handed her the clipboard. Tucked beneath the maintenance schedule was a folded printout from the Essex program website, evening certificate requirements highlighted in yellow. Naomi looked up sharply. Daniel gave the smallest shrug. "I saw the brochure corner in your bag last week when you were digging for your time card." Naomi stared at the page, then at him. "I was not snooping," he said. "I was observing. There is a difference." For the first time that morning, the cold fluorescent light did not feel quite so harsh. "Why are you showing me this?" Naomi asked. Daniel rested one hand on the doorframe. "Because this building teaches people the wrong lesson if they stay in one place too long. It starts to convince them that access belongs to the people with offices instead of the people who understand how everything actually runs." He tapped the highlighted sheet with one calloused finger. "Learn the systems. Learn the numbers. Learn the contracts. People at the top like to act as if power begins in boardrooms. Usually it begins with whoever understands what everyone else overlooks." Naomi held the page carefully, as if it had gained weight. Down the hall, a phone rang, then another. The day was starting. Daniel stepped back toward the corridor. "I can switch your Thursday shift if you need to make night classes," he said. "I cannot do miracles, but I can move a schedule." Then he walked off before she could answer, keys brushing softly against his hip. Naomi stood in the restroom with the printout in one hand and the dispenser key in the other, the mirror catching her reflection from 3 angles at once. Gray uniform, tired eyes, steady mouth. A woman who had spent years cleaning a building that measured value in square footage and view lines. She looked at herself for one long second, then folded the printout and slipped it into her pocket beside Laverne's peppermint. Outside, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the day moved forward. The first Thursday night class began with freezing rain and a bus that arrived 19 minutes late. Naomi spent the whole ride to campus standing near the back door with one hand gripping the rail and the other protecting her folder from the damp coats pressing in around her. By the time she reached Essex County College, the cuffs of her uniform pants were dark with slush and the straps of her tote had bitten deep red lines into her shoulder. The campus lights glowed through the mist in soft yellow halos, and the wet pavement reflected every step like a second world trembling beneath the first. She pushed through the glass doors of the business building with her breath still uneven from hurrying and stopped for half a second in the lobby, taking in bulletin boards, vending machines, the smell of old carpet and burnt coffee, the ordinary tiredness of a place built for people trying to become something between jobs and rent and family obligations. It was not beautiful, but it was honest. Room 214 was already half full when she stepped inside. Students sat in molded plastic. Chairs behind narrow desks, some in scrubs, some in work boots. One man still wearing a delivery company jacket with reflective strips on the sleeves. A young mother in a fast food visor flipped through a textbook while bouncing her knee under the desk. An older man with silver stubble and reading glasses was typing numbers into a calculator like he was afraid the machine might test him back. Naomi took a seat near the side wall, smoothed the front of her uniform, and set down her folder with hands she hoped looked steadier than they felt. On the whiteboard, written in blue marker, were 3 words that made her chest tighten more than she expected: property, systems, value. Professor Elena Ramirez walked in at exactly 6:30 carrying a canvas tote, a stack of printed syllabi, and the kind of calm that suggested she had spent years managing rooms full of people who had every reason to doubt themselves. She was in her late 40s maybe, dark hair pinned at the nape of her neck, low heels clicking softly on tile, no wasted movement anywhere in her. "Good evening," she said, setting the papers down. If you are here, it means you are tired. I respect that. If you stay, it means you are serious. I respect that more. A few people smiled without meaning to. Naomi did too. The class began with introductions, not names only, but jobs, reasons for enrolling, what buildings meant to them beyond walls and rent. When it was Naomi's turn, she felt every old instinct tell her to keep it small, keep it plain, do not hand strangers anything they can misunderstand. But something about the room, the rain tapping the windows, the fluorescent lights buzzing gently overhead, the visible fatigue on every face, made truth feel less dangerous than usual. I work in commercial maintenance in Midtown, she said. I enrolled because I am tired of being close to systems I am not allowed to understand. The room went still for a beat. Professor Ramirez nodded once, slowly, as if she had heard something familiar there. That, she said, is a very good reason. For the next 90 minutes Naomi took notes so fast the side of her hand turned gray with graphite. Operating costs, tenant retention, deferred maintenance, capital improvements, net operating income, terms she had brushed against for years without being invited inside them. She copied each one in careful print, underlined definitions, circled examples, drew arrows when concepts connected. The lecture was not easy, but it made a kind of deep practical sense to her. Buildings as living systems. Value as something shaped by choices, timing, neglect, stewardship. She had known those things already in one language. The language of leaks, foot traffic, worn grout, broken dispensers, carpets that held more history than they showed. Now she was hearing them in another language, the one used in conference rooms and lease reviews and investment briefings. It felt less like learning from scratch and more like finally being handed the missing half of a map. During the break, she stood by the vending machines with a paper cup of coffee that tasted burned and thin, but warm enough to matter. The young mother from the front row glanced at Naomi's gray work shirt and smiled. Straight from work too? Naomi nodded. Midtown, airport concession stand. The woman said, lifting her visor with 2 fingers and rolling her eyes. We are all glamorous here. They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh tired people share when there is no extra energy for pretending. Then Naomi's phone vibrated in her tote. She stepped into the hallway to answer and heard her mother's breathing before the first word. Not severe, but strained enough to sharpen every muscle in Naomi's body. Lorraine tried to sound casual. Baby, I am fine. I just ran short coming up the stairs after laundry. Naomi stared out through the narrow hallway window at rain glazing the parking lot under the streetlights. Fine was a word people used when they did not want to become a problem. Did you take the inhaler? Naomi asked. Yes. And the evening pill? Yes. A pause. Then softer. Do not come running home. Go back to class. Naomi closed her eyes for one breath. Through the classroom door, she could hear chairs scraping and students settling back in. In her hand, the paper cup was cooling too fast. Between her fingers, the edge of her notebook page pressed like a blade. This was the cost Daniel had not written on the highlighted printout. Not just money. Division. The constant slicing of oneself away from another. Daughter from student. Worker from thinker. Survival from becoming. I will call Mrs. Green upstairs and have her check on you, Naomi said. Lorraine gave a little hum of agreement, but Naomi knew that sound too. It was gratitude wrapped in guilt. After the call ended, Naomi stood in the hallway a second longer than the moment allowed. The rain ticking steadily at the glass, the vending machine humming behind her, the smell of coffee and wet coats filling the air. Then she straightened her shoulders, took the last cold swallow from the paper cup, and walked back into room 214. Professor Ramirez had written a sentence across the board while Naomi was out. Ownership begins where excuses end. Naomi looked at the words, then sat down and opened her notebook to a clean page. Winter turned into spring, one schedule change, one overdue bill, one late bus, one completed assignment at a time. Naomi stopped thinking of progress as a staircase because staircases suggested something clean and upward and visible. What her life became instead was closer to scaffolding, temporary, narrow, exhausting, always one misstep away from shaking, but still rising if she kept climbing. She worked mornings and afternoons in Manhattan, rode to Newark at night for class twice a week, and studied at the kitchen table after her mother had gone to sleep, highlighter in one hand, calculator in the other, the apartment lit by a single lamp and the blue wash of distant television through the wall from next door. She learned to read operating statements the way she already read floors, by pattern first, then by flaw. She learned that a building told on itself if you knew where to look, in repair logs, vacancy rates, energy spikes, deferred maintenance hidden under new paint, rent concessions buried in friendly language. During the day, she cleaned conference rooms where men spoke in percentages and projections. At night, she translated those same words into notes she could afford to own. By March, Daniel Pierce had quietly started giving her extra tasks that were not officially hers. Check the inventory sheets before ordering paper products. Log the restroom fixture repairs by floor and compare them to tenant complaints. Shadow the vendor during the monthly HVAC filter replacement and note the service intervals. He never framed it as a favor. That was part of why Naomi trusted it. He simply handed her work that required attention and let her prove what she saw. Do not just do the task, he told her one morning in the basement supply room while a delivery cart rattled past the door. Ask why the task exists. That is where the useful people separate themselves from the replaceable ones. Naomi carried the sentence with her all week. She asked why a hallway on 17 needed fresh carpet less often than one on 12. She asked why the legal floor always got upgraded fixtures before the engineering firm on 28. She asked why one tenant never complained directly, but still had more service tickets than anyone else in the building. The answers were never just about maintenance. They were about money, leverage, appearances, which problems had powerful witnesses and which could be postponed because the people affected did not sit in rooms with views. In class, Professor Ramirez noticed the precision in Naomi's assignments almost before Naomi noticed it herself. One Tuesday evening, after a session on lease structuring and building valuation, she stopped Naomi on the way out. The hallway smelled like floor wax and stale coffee, and students were already filing past them toward the parking lot with tired shoulders and half-zip jackets. You understand buildings from the inside out, Professor Ramirez said, slipping attendance sheets into a folder. That is rarer than you think. Naomi adjusted the strap of her tote. I just know where things break. Professor Ramirez gave a slight smile. Exactly. Most investors learn numbers first and reality later. The expensive ones never learn reality at all. Then she handed Naomi a printed notice about a city scholarship for women pursuing commercial property credentials. Apply tonight, she said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Naomi did. She filled out the form at the kitchen table with her mother asleep in the next room and the radiator hissing under the window. She wrote about maintenance routes, invisible labor, systems, and access. 2 weeks later, the scholarship covered enough of her remaining tuition to let her breathe for the first time in months without immediately calculating the cost of air. By summer, Naomi's pace had become something almost inhuman in its steadiness. Up before dawn. Bus to Manhattan. Shift at Holloway Tower. Notes on lunch break. Night class. Homework. Laundry after midnight. Grocery list taped to the fridge. Her mother's medication chart updated every Sunday. Calls from Terrence that always began with, I am fine, and ended with Naomi asking whether fine. Included food. There were losses inside that pace too, the small quiet kind no one congratulated you for surviving. She stopped answering Marcus, the kind mechanic from Bloomfield she had gone out with twice before classes started because there was no room left in her week for being known softly by anyone new. She missed a church anniversary dinner she had promised her mother they would attend. She fell asleep once on the bus with her notebook open and woke with a crease across her cheek from the spiral binding and a page of half-finished numbers blurred by the sway of the ride. Through all of it, Holloway Tower remained what it had always been on the outside, gleaming, self-assured, expensive enough to mistake polish for permanence. Richard Holloway drifted through it like a man still certain the building reflected him more than anyone else. Naomi saw him only in flashes that summer, crossing the lobby with investors, stepping from black sedans, speaking into his phone with that low impatient calm that made other men hurry. But now when she looked at him, she no longer saw only the power. She saw structure, debt hidden behind expansion, image management dressed as discipline. A man admired by people who had never seen what it cost the rest of the building to keep his version of order intact. One hot afternoon in late July, Naomi was updating supply counts in the service office when Daniel dropped a thin folder beside her clipboard. "What is this?" she asked. "Temporary assignment," he said. "Front desk support for 2 weeks. Angela is out after surgery, and Sandra wants someone who already knows tenant names and floor flow." Naomi looked up sharply. "Me?" Daniel gave a short nod. "You know more about this building than half the people greeting clients in the lobby. Just wear the navy blazer they issue, and do not let the title confuse you." The folder in front of her held a temporary access badge, a list of executive tenants, and a short training schedule. Naomi ran her thumb over the edge of the badge. It felt light in her hand, but the meaning of it settled heavily. This was not a promotion. Not yet. But it was a threshold. A new angle of sight. Another room inside the same machine. Daniel rested one hand on the back of the chair beside her. "Some doors open quietly," he said. "Walk through before somebody louder gets there first." Naomi looked at the Navy badge, at her own name printed above the words Guest Services Support, and then toward the ceiling as if she could see all 47 floors stacked above her at once. The offices, hallways, locked suites, conference tables, and private lounges. The whole gleaming system. For a second, she remembered the brass planter on the 39th floor, Richard Holloway's polished voice, the sentence about positions and lines. Then she clipped the badge to her uniform pocket and stood up. On Naomi's first morning at the front desk, Holloway Tower looked less like a building and more like a performance she had finally been invited to watch from the front row. The lobby ceiling rose in pale stone arcs above polished black floors that reflected shoes, briefcases, and the slow revolving doors turning with mechanical grace. The reception desk curved in a half-moon of dark wood and brushed steel, positioned with the kind of confidence that assumed everyone approaching it had somewhere important to be. Naomi stood behind it in the issued navy blazer, her maintenance badge replaced for the week by a temporary guest services card clipped neatly at her lapel, and tried not to feel the strange split inside herself. Same woman, same building, different side of the marble. Sandra Lee trained her in 20 minutes that felt more like an audit than an introduction. Visitor log, executive calls, freight elevator restrictions, preferred language for speaking to tenants. "Do not say no unless you absolutely have to," Sandra said, her voice low and precise as she clicked through the scheduling screen. "Say, let me see what I can do." This building survives on the appearance of effortless solutions. Naomi glanced at the monitor, at the grid of names, suites, arrivals, and private bookings. Even when the solutions are not effortless. Sandra gave her a flat look that almost hid the flicker of respect beneath it. Especially then. By 9 o'clock, the lobby had filled with the weekday rush. Men in tailored suits, women with polished heels and leather portfolios, delivery runners, assistants balancing coffees, security staff speaking softly into earpieces. Naomi handled visitor badges, answered questions, redirected a florist, coordinated a courier delay, and memorized faces as quickly as the revolving doors delivered them. She learned that from the front desk. Power had its own choreography. Who got greeted first? Who was expected without ever having to announce themselves? Who treated staff like fixtures, and who offered a thank you as if it still cost something? Around 10:15, Richard Holloway crossed the lobby from the private elevator bank with 2 men in navy suits and a woman in cream carrying a tablet. Naomi recognized the rhythm of him before she fully looked up, the contained stride, the silver at his temples, the air around him tightening not because he was loud, but because everyone else adjusted around him. He was speaking mid-sentence about refinancing terms and occupancy projections when his gaze shifted toward the desk and landed on Naomi. The smallest pause followed. Not enough for anyone else to notice. More than enough for her. He did not break stride. "Ms. Carter," he said, as if her presence there required immediate categorization inside whatever private ledger he kept on people. "Sir," Naomi answered. One of the men with him glanced between them, curious for half a beat, then moved on. Holloway's eyes skimmed the guest services badge at her lapel, then returned to her face. There was no laughter in him now, no open disdain, just that same old instinct to place things where he thought they belonged and become irritated when they moved. "Temporary assignment?" he asked. Naomi kept her tone level. "Yes, sir." Holloway gave a slight nod that could have meant anything from acknowledgement to disapproval and continued toward the revolving doors, his entourage moving with him like satellites around a fixed idea of importance. Naomi watched the reflection of them slide across the black floor and disappear into daylight. Sandra, standing 2 terminals down, said nothing for several seconds. Then, without looking up from her screen, she murmured, "You answered that better than most people do." Naomi signed in a visitor from a law firm before replying. It was a simple question. Sandra's fingers paused over the keyboard. "No," she said quietly. "Nothing involving him ever is." The morning passed in a blur of names and schedules until just after noon, when the trouble began, not dramatic at first, just a series of small wrong notes that only sounded dangerous if you knew how buildings behaved. The first came as a complaint from Suite 4102 that the conference room on 41 was too warm. Then another from 43 about weak airflow near the west offices. 10 minutes later, the facilities line lit up twice in a row, and Naomi heard Daniel's voice clipped tighter than usual as he asked whether any executive meetings were scheduled above the 40th floor that afternoon. She checked the board. Investor luncheon on 39. Legal review on 42. A private media strategy session in the Sky Lounge on 44. "Why?" Naomi asked. There was a hiss of radio static on Daniel's end. "Control panel is reading unstable pressure in the upper air handling zone," he said. "Might be a faulty sensor. Might be more. We are checking." Naomi looked across the lobby at the silent beauty of the elevator bank, the brass trim, the floral arrangement refreshed that morning, white lilies and eucalyptus arranged as if elegance could prevent systems from failing. "Do you need anything from me?" she asked. "Just keep your ears open," Daniel said. "Front desk hears panic before maintenance does." He hung up before she could answer. Naomi returned the receiver slowly to its cradle. Around her, the lobby still gleamed. People still crossed it with coffees, badges, and appointments. But once you had spent enough years inside buildings, you learned that trouble often arrived like weather, first pressure, then temperature, then the shift in everyone's breathing before the storm had a name. At 12:40, Sandra's desk phone rang from upstairs, and she answered with her usual polished calm. Naomi saw the calm leave her face 3 seconds later. "Understood," Sandra said, standing at once. "We are notifying operations now." She covered the handset and looked directly at Naomi. The 44th floor executive lounge just lost cooling entirely. The room is full. Press guests are up there. And Mr. Holloway is hosting. Naomi felt the moment tighten like a wire. Sandra's hand dropped from the receiver. "This cannot become public," she said, and for once the sentence did not sound like office management. It sounded like fear. Naomi looked toward the elevators, their mirrored doors sealed and shining under the lobby lights. Somewhere above them, inside the expensive upper floors where comfort was treated like a birthright, the building had started telling the truth about itself. And Richard Holloway, surrounded by investors, cameras, and carefully managed appearances, was standing right inside the part of the truth he could no longer politely ignore. The first sign that the problem was bigger than one overheated room came through the elevator sensors. Red indicators flickered on Sandra's screen beside floors 41 through 44, not a shutdown, not yet, but a warning that the upper bank was starting to cycle irregularly. Naomi had spent enough months learning the building from behind walls and beneath polished surfaces to know what that meant. Cooling failure in the executive lounge was not just discomfort. It meant the upper air handling zone was unstable, pressure imbalances were spreading, and if the control system overcorrected, half the top floors could start failing one after another in front of clients, investors, and reporters who lived off turning polished reputations into headlines. Sandra was already on the phone with operations again, voice clipped and tight, while security exchanged glances that tried to remain professional and did not quite succeed. In the middle of it all, the lobby kept performing normal. Revolving doors turned. Shoes crossed marble. A courier signed for a package. Somewhere near the east seating area, someone laughed at something on a phone call, unaware that 40 floors above them an expensive illusion was beginning to sweat through its makeup. Naomi looked at the floor map on the monitor and saw it before anyone said it aloud. The West Side service bypass for the upper climate system had been flagged on a maintenance bulletin 3 weeks earlier. Not critical, delayed for review, pushed behind visible upgrades scheduled for investor season. She remembered the note because Daniel had shown her how often buildings revealed their values through what they postponed. A decorative refresh in the lobby had gone forward. A non-public systems correction had waited. Now the building was answering in real time. Sandra, Naomi said, keeping her voice even. When was the last manual override test on the Upper West bypass? Sandra pulled the handset from her ear just enough to look at her. What? The Upper West bypass, Naomi repeated. If the pressure sensor is forcing the system to chase bad readings, a manual reroute could stabilize the top floors long enough to cool the lounge and protect the conference rooms. Sandra stared at her for half a second, caught between urgency and the old reflex that sorted certain knowledge into certain bodies. That is an operations call, she said. Yes, Naomi answered. But operations is not standing at this desk hearing the order. The floors are failing in. Daniel came over the radio then, his voice rough with movement and strain. Main diagnostics are lagging. We may need to isolate the upper zone manually. Naomi reached for the desk phone before Sandra could stop her and hit the internal line to facilities. Daniel, it is Naomi. Start with the west bypass damper on 41. The pattern is moving upward, not random. If you stabilize the west pressure first, the lounge may recover before the east side chases the imbalance. There was a beat of silence, then the sound of Daniel taking in air through his nose. How sure are you? More sure than the screen, Naomi said. The failure started in rooms that sit over the west stack. 44 only got hit when the system tried to compensate. Another pause. In the background she could hear keys jangling, footsteps, a heavy door opening. All right, Daniel said. Stay by the desk. Feed me any changes. Sandra looked at Naomi as if the lobby floor had shifted under both of them. You should not have just done that. Naomi kept her eyes on the monitor. I know. Upstairs, the pressure lines held red for another long 30 seconds. Then one by one the warnings began to soften. First 41, then 42, then a blinking amber on 44 where full failure had been. Sandra snatched up the ringing phone from the executive lounge. Yes, she said, posture rigid. Her expression changed almost immediately. Not relief exactly, but the startled shape relief makes when it arrives through someone you underestimated. Understood, she said quietly. Thank you. She set the phone down with unusual care. Cooling is returning. Naomi let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Across the lobby, the revolving doors opened and a gust of late summer heat swept briefly across the marble before sealing out again. Sandra folded her arms, then unfolded them. How did you know that? Naomi looked at the monitor, at the floors stacked in orderly columns, at the neat digital version of a building whose real truths usually stayed hidden in vents, service corridors, and postponed decisions. Because I have been paying attention to what this place hides, she said. The private elevator chimed less than 2 minutes later. Richard Holloway stepped out alone this time. No investor orbit, no polished half-circle of assistants and advisors around. His tie was loosened slightly, just enough to suggest a disruption he had not chosen to reveal. Behind his usual composure, something harder to name moved through his face. Not only anger, though that was there, and not only embarrassment, though that too clung to him like the last trace of heat from upstairs. It was recognition, unwanted and undeniable. He crossed the lobby directly to the desk. Sandra straightened. Naomi remained still. Holloway's gaze moved first to Sandra, then to Naomi, and stayed there. I am told, he said, voice low and controlled, that the situation upstairs was contained because of a recommendation made from this desk. Sandra answered first. Yes, sir. Holloway did not look away from Naomi. Why you? Naomi met his eyes. The marble beneath the desk seemed colder suddenly, the air thinner, the whole lobby holding its own breath. I recognized a pattern, she said. He studied her in silence long enough for the sounds of the building to grow strange around them. The soft ding of an elevator, the rustle of a newspaper, the distant hum of conditioned air moving again through ducts above expensive ceilings. Then he gave the slightest nod, as if confirming a fact he had resisted too long to be surprised by now. Very well, he said. The words were formal, almost sterile, but they did not erase what had happened. He had come down expecting control, and found himself standing in front of the woman he once tried to reduce to a uniform and a stain. Naomi saw it land in him all at once. Not yet humility, not yet apology, but the first cold crack in certainty. Holloway turned to Sandra. No press mention of the incident. Route all inquiries through communications. Then, after the briefest pause, he looked back at Naomi. "Ms. Carter," he said, "come to the 39th floor at 4 o'clock." He left before either woman could answer. The private elevator doors closed around him with a polished whisper. Sandra stood motionless for a second, then exhaled through parted lips. "You just got summoned upstairs by the man who does not summon people unless he intends to use the meeting." Naomi unclipped a visitor badge from the printer tray and laid it neatly beside the sign-in sheet. Her hands were steady. "Maybe," she said. In the monitor reflection, she caught a faint image of herself in the navy blazer behind the dark wood desk, the same woman who used to polish fingerprints from brass, while men in glass offices decided where lines should stay. 4 o'clock was still hours away. The lobby resumed its performance around her, seamless, elegant, expensive. But under the smooth surface, something had shifted, and for once it had not shifted in his favor. At 3:56, Naomi stepped off the private elevator onto the 39th floor and felt the old memory return before the doors had even closed behind her. The same muted carpet. The same glass walls holding the late afternoon light, like something curated. The same controlled silence that expensive spaces wore like perfume. Months earlier, she had stood in this corridor in a cleaning apron with brass polish on her hands and Richard Holloway's contempt hanging in the air between them like cold smoke. Now she wore the Navy Guest Services blazer, her hair neatly pinned back, her notebook tucked beneath one arm, and the difference was just enough to make the memory sharper instead of softer. At the far end of the corridor, Sandra was waiting outside the conference room with a tablet against her chest. Her expression was unreadable in that practiced corporate way Naomi had come to recognize, but there was less distance in it than before. "He is finishing a call," Sandra said quietly. "You can wait inside." Naomi nodded and stepped into the room. The conference table stretched nearly the length of the space, dark walnut under a line of suspended lights. Beyond the windows, Manhattan glowed in the softened gold of early evening, towers catching the sun at their edges, the river a sheet of dull silver in the distance. The room smelled faintly of leather, coffee, and the cool recycled air that had nearly betrayed everyone upstairs only hours earlier. Naomi set her notebook on the table, but did not sit. She looked instead at the brass planter near the entrance, polished bright, reflecting a distorted version of the room in its curved surface. Not a fingerprint on it. Not a smudge. Someone had kept appearances perfect. A moment later, the side door opened and Richard Holloway entered alone. No assistant. No attorney. No audience. He closed the door behind him and stood for a second with one hand still resting on the handle, as if the gesture gave him time to decide which version of himself had come into the room. He wore the same kind of suit he always wore, dark, immaculate, fitted to a life of board meetings and private cars, but something in his posture had changed since morning. Not weakened. Adjusted. A man discovering that control was easier to display than to maintain. "Ms. Carter," he said. Naomi met his gaze. "Mr. Holloway." He moved to the far side of the table and laid a thin folder down with deliberate care. "I reviewed the incident reports from today," he said. "Daniel Pierce confirmed your assessment of the Upper West bypass issue. He also informed me that this is not the first time you have demonstrated knowledge beyond your assigned role." Naomi said nothing. Silence, she had learned, made certain people reveal more than questions ever did. Holloway glanced briefly toward the windows, then back at her. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said, and the sentence seemed to cost him more than the building probably had. Naomi kept still. He took a slow breath. "Months ago, in this corridor, I made assumptions about you that were wrong." The air in the room felt very still. Outside the glass, a helicopter moved slowly over the river, small and soundless from this height. Naomi had imagined 1,000 versions of this moment in the angry privacy of buses and night classes and long shifts where her shoes pinched by noon. In most of them, she said something sharp enough to leave a mark. Something perfect and unforgettable. But standing there now, with the room quiet and the city spread wide behind him, she understood that the mark had already been made. Not by her words, by her endurance, by skill, by time. "You were not mistaken about my position," Naomi said at last, her voice calm. "You were mistaken about my value." Something moved in Holloway's face then, a brief, unguarded flinch of recognition. Not because she had wounded him, but because she had named the truth in language too clean to dodge. He lowered his eyes for a second, then opened the folder and slid a document across the table toward her. "This is a recommendation for internal advancement," he said. "Facilities coordination track, with tuition support for completion of your certificate." Naomi looked down at the paper without touching it. Her name sat at the top in formal print. Proposed role. Salary adjustment. Training review period. Education assistance. The words seemed almost unreal against the heavy cream stationery. Holloway rested his fingertips lightly on the table edge. "It is not charity," he said. "It is overdue correction." Naomi finally looked at the document, then back at him. "Why now?" she asked. The question stayed in the room between them, plain and impossible to dress up. Holloway did not answer immediately. For once, the silence around him did not feel like strategy. It felt like a man searching through his own ruins for a sentence honest enough to stand on. "Because I built a career believing I understood people quickly," he said. "Who was useful? Who belonged in which room?" That kind of certainty can look like strength for a long time. He glanced toward the brass planter by the door, perhaps without realizing it. "Today was not the first day you proved me wrong. It was simply the first day I could no longer pretend not to notice." Naomi listened without softening, but without cruelty either. The old anger was still in her somewhere, layered under memory and bus rides and fluorescent nights, and every small humiliation that had taught her how easily dignity was tested when no one in power had to risk losing theirs. But alongside it now was something steadier. She could see him clearly for the first time, not as a giant, not as a villain carved entirely from arrogance, but as a man shaped by systems that had rewarded his blindness until the cost of it finally reached his own floor. "I am going to finish my program," she said. "With or without this." Holloway gave a slow nod. "I believe that." Naomi rested her fingers on the edge of the document at last. The paper was thick, expensive, smooth beneath her hand. She thought of her mother in the recliner by the amber lamp, of Daniel sliding her that highlighted printout in the restroom doorway, of Professor Ramirez writing "Ownership begins where excuses end" across a whiteboard while rain tapped the windows, of herself on crowded buses with wet cuffs and a tired spine, carrying a future in a frayed tote bag. Then she looked at Richard Holloway, the billionaire who once laughed at her in a marble lobby because he thought some people were only ever meant to clean what others owned. "I will consider it," she said. He inclined his head once, accepting the answer as if he understood it was more grace than he had earned. Naomi picked up the paper and tucked it into her notebook. When she turned to leave, Holloway stepped aside from the door before she reached it, an instinctive motion, small but unmistakable. For the first time since she had entered his orbit, he made space instead of demanding it. Naomi passed him without haste. In the polished brass planter by the door, she caught the brief reflection of both of them at once. The man who had mistaken status for worth and the woman he had once failed to see, now walking out of the room holding her own future in her hands. When Naomi stepped back into the elevator, the paper inside her notebook felt heavier than it should have, as if weight could come not only from cost, but from consequence. The doors closed on the 39th floor with their usual polished whisper, and for a moment she was alone in the mirrored box with her own reflection looking back at her from 3 angles at once. Navy blazer, tired eyes, one loose strand of hair near her temple. A woman who had spent months learning not just how to survive a building like this, but how to read it until its hidden language became plain. As the elevator descended, floor numbers glowed one by one in soft amber light. 38, 37, 36, and Naomi felt the strange quiet that sometimes follows a moment you have imagined for so long that reality arrives almost gently. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something steadier, a private settling of the bones. By the time she crossed the lobby and stepped out into the late summer evening, Manhattan was turning gold at the edges. Sunlight struck the glass of the surrounding towers and broke into warm shards across the avenue. Taxis moved in a slow yellow stream. A food cart on the corner sent up the smell of onions and grilled meat into the city air. Naomi stood on the sidewalk for one breath, then another, the current of people moving around her in practiced impatience, and reached into her tote for her phone. Her mother answered on the second ring. "You are off early," Lorraine said. Naomi smiled despite herself. "Not early, just finished with something." There was a pause shaped like maternal intuition. Something good. Naomi looked up at Holloway Tower behind her, all steel and reflected sky. The revolving doors catching and releasing strangers who would never know how many invisible hands held that place together. Something earned, she said. Lorraine was quiet for a second, then made the soft sound she always made when joy met caution in the same room. Come home and tell me properly. Naomi took the bus back to Newark with the notebook held against her chest the whole ride, not out of fear someone would steal it, but because some things deserved to be carried like they mattered. The sky darkened over the turnpike in long bands of lavender and gray. At one stop, a little boy climbed aboard with his grandmother and stared sleepily out the window while she held a grocery bag in one hand and his small wrist in the other. Across the aisle, a woman in scrubs leaned her head against the glass and closed her eyes before the bus had even pulled away. Naomi looked at all of them and felt again what she had felt in class, in break rooms, in service corridors, in crowded night buses full of people nobody wrote articles about. The city did not run on the people who owned the views. It ran on the people too tired to admire them. At home, Lorraine was waiting at the kitchen table in her blue house sweater with her glasses low on her nose and a dish towel folded in her lap. The apartment smelled like rice, garlic, and the lemon cleaner Naomi had used on the counters that morning before dawn. The familiar lamp glow softened everything. The worn cabinet handles, the stack of unopened mail, the small cracks in the painted wall near the window. Naomi set down her bag, pulled the document from her notebook, and placed it on the table between them. Lorraine read slowly, moving her lips over some of the formal language, then looked up with shining eyes. She blinked clear before tears could fully gather. Facilities coordination, she said softly. Tuition support. Naomi sat down across from her. It is an offer, not a promise. Lorraine laid one hand flat over the page. Her fingers were thinner than they used to be, but still elegant. Baby all. Real doors begin as offers. Naomi laughed quietly, tired enough for the sound to come out almost like a sigh. Then she told her everything. The cooling failure, the pattern, Daniel trusting her call, the summons upstairs, Richard Holloway standing in that same corridor and speaking words he probably had not planned to say in this lifetime. Lorraine listened without interrupting, the way she always did when something important needed full room to become true. When Naomi finished, the apartment seemed to settle around them. Outside, someone across the street was playing old soul music low through an open window. The radiator clicked once even though the weather was still warm. Somewhere in the building a door closed, then another. Lorraine reached across the table and covered Naomi's hand with her own. Do not let his correction become the measure of your worth, she said. It matters because it changed your path, but it does not define your value. You were valuable when he laughed. You were valuable when nobody helped. You were valuable before any man in a suit learned how to say your name with respect. Naomi looked down at their hands on the scratched kitchen table and felt something in her loosen that she had been holding tight for so long she no longer knew it was there. I know, she said. And now she did. The months that followed moved with the same hard rhythm, but not the same meaning. Naomi accepted the role after negotiating the terms with more calm than anyone at Holloway Tower expected from a woman they once imagined would take gratitude in place of leverage. She finished her certificate one course at a time, still taking the late bus, still studying under yellow kitchen light, still carrying peppermints in her pocket and notes in the margins of utility reports. Daniel retired the next spring and shook her hand in the service corridor with eyes suspiciously bright. Professor Ramirez hugged her after graduation and said, now go where the decisions are made and ask better questions than they are comfortable answering. Sandra became unexpectedly useful, sending Naomi reports before meetings and once, in a tone almost casual, admitting, you saw this place more clearly than the rest of us because no one thought to hide it from you. Even Richard Holloway changed, not all at once and not into a saint, because life did not work that way, but enough for the people around him to feel the adjustment. He listened longer, interrupted less, asked maintenance questions before lobby design questions. Once, passing Naomi in a hallway during her first month in coordination, he paused and held the door for a delivery porter whose hands were full. It was a small thing. That was why it mattered. Years later, when Lorraine's health had steadied, when Terrence had finished school, when Naomi's title had changed twice, and then once more, When the ownership group that controlled Holloway Tower restructured under pressure from numbers Naomi understood better than anyone expected, she stood in a conference room on the 46th floor with a set of keys, signed papers, and the final documents transferring controlling interest of the building to the investment partnership she now led. The windows were open a fraction that day, enough to let in a thread of autumn air carrying the faint sounds of the city below. The polished table reflected her hands as she closed the folder. On the wall of glass behind her, Manhattan shimmered under a pale October sun. Someone congratulated her. Someone else used the word remarkable. Naomi thanked them, but the words passed over her lightly. After the room cleared, she walked alone to the corridor outside and stopped beside a brass planter near the entrance, newer than the old one on 39, but shining in exactly the same way. In its curved surface, she could see a soft, bent reflection of herself, tailored coat, calm face. The city's light caught at her shoulder. For a moment, she remembered another version of that reflection, a woman in a gray uniform holding a rag in one hand, while a billionaire tried to remind her where the lines were. Naomi touched the rim of the planter with 2 fingers, then let her hand fall. The building was quiet around her, the good kind of quiet, not silence enforced from above, but the steady breath of a system finally understood. Down below, elevators rose and fell. Vents moved air through hidden passageways. Doors opened for tenants, cleaners, assistants, couriers, executives, all of them entering the same structure under different names. Naomi stood in the warm band of afternoon light and listened. She had not changed the whole city. She had not erased every cruelty stitched into the world that had. Once looked at a black cleaning woman and seen only someone meant to disappear into labor. But she had crossed every line they drew for her without asking permission. She had learned the language behind the walls. She had carried her future in a frayed tote bag until it became real enough to hold steel and glass and policy and paychecks and people's dignity all at once. And in the end, the man who once owned the room had learned too late that kindness was not weakness, that attention was power, that the people he overlooked were often the only reason anything stayed standing. Naomi turned from the brass planter and walked down the corridor toward the elevator, her footsteps quiet on the carpet, her breathing even, the late sun following her for a few more feet before the doors opened and received her. Years after the ownership papers had been signed and the headlines had moved on to younger founders and louder scandals, Naomi Carter still arrived before most of the lights came on. Not because she had to. Not because anyone was checking. Habit had simply become part of her moral architecture, the quiet discipline built from years when arriving early meant surviving. On that October morning, Holloway Tower stood against the pale blue Manhattan sky with the same polished confidence it had always worn, all glass and clean lines and silent money. But inside, the building breathed differently now. The lobby no longer smelled only of expensive flowers and stone cooled by hidden air. At 6:10 in the morning, it also held the warm scent of fresh coffee from the staff station Naomi had ordered installed behind the service corridor door, so the overnight cleaners and security guards did not have to start their shift on vending machine powder and stale bitterness. The marble still shone. The brass still reflected the world in softened curves. But there were chairs now in the lower operations office with real back support, a scholarship fund for employee education posted on a framed notice near the break room, and a policy Naomi had written herself requiring executive trainees to spend 2 full mornings shadowing maintenance, security, and housekeeping before receiving floor privileges above 30. She called it systems literacy. The younger associates called it humbling. She let both names live. Naomi crossed the lobby in a charcoal wool coat with a leather folio under her arm and paused beside the reception desk where a new employee, 22 at most, was setting out visitor badges in careful color order. Her name was Tasha Bell, a black college student from Queens with quick hands and a quicker mind, who had started 3 weeks earlier and still apologized every time she asked a smart question, as if intelligence were an interruption. "Good morning, Miss Carter," Tasha said, straightening a little too fast. Naomi smiled and set her coffee on the desk. "Good morning, Tasha. Did you review the tenant arrival sheet for the legal conference?" Tasha nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I flagged the early couriers and the dietary note for Suite 32. Naomi glanced at the screen, then at the young woman's posture, shoulders held tight, with that familiar hunger to do everything perfectly before anybody could decide she did not belong there. Naomi knew that posture intimately. She had worn it for years until it nearly became part of her spine. "You do not have to brace every time you answer me," Naomi said gently. Tasha blinked. "I am sorry." Naomi gave a small, amused breath. "That is exactly what I mean." A faint flush rose in Tasha's face, but then she smiled, a real one this time. Naomi leaned one hip against the desk and lowered her voice. "Competence does not need to apologize for itself. Let the work stand up before you do." Tasha looked at her for a second, as if committing the sentence to a private place she might need later. Then she nodded more slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Naomi picked up her coffee again and headed toward the elevators, the polished floor catching a long reflection of her coat in the early light. On the 39th floor, the city spread wide and silver beyond the glass, the East River catching the first sunlight in broken strips. Her office used to belong to two men before her, both of whom had filled it with darker furniture and louder art meant to suggest decisiveness. Naomi had kept the windows clear, changed the chairs, added a long bookshelf with binders and framed photographs. Lorraine smiling in her blue sweater at a small family dinner, Terrence in graduation robes, Daniel Pierce squinting in the sunlight outside the building on his retirement day, Professor Ramirez holding a coffee cup and pointing at Naomi from across a banquet table as if still telling her to ask better questions than the room could comfortably answer. Near the window sat a potted peace lily thriving better than anyone expected. At 8:30, the executive operations meeting began. Department heads gathered around the conference table with tablets, printouts, coffee, and the carefully neutral expressions people brought into rooms where budgets and pride often collided. Richard Holloway attended as board chair emeritus now, no longer the unchallenged center of gravity, but still present enough that silence occasionally bent around him out of old habit. Age had refined him in some ways and exposed him in others. His hair had gone whiter at the temples. His voice had grown less clipped. He asked more questions than declarations these days, and though he still wore wealth like a second tailoring, something in him had softened from certainty into observation. He sat halfway down the table while Naomi led the meeting from the head, reviewing retention rates, energy efficiency upgrades, vendor accountability, and the expansion of the employee education fund that had already sent 6 staff members into certificate programs and 1 security guard into night school for accounting. When the facilities report ended, a younger board member named Evan Mercer frowned at the numbers on his screen. He was the kind of man who had inherited polish before earning perspective, 30-something, expensive watch, perfect cuff, voice trained to sound collaborative while still assuming the room would swing toward him. "I understand the goodwill angle," he said, tapping the page with one finger, "but the staff development line has grown again this quarter. At some point we have to ask whether these upward mobility initiatives are operationally necessary or just philosophically satisfying." The room went still in a very old way. Naomi saw it in Tasha's face once, in herself 100 times, in every worker who had ever understood that some questions were not really about budget. They were about who people believed should remain useful and who might become too visible if given a ladder. Naomi folded her hands loosely on the table. Before she could answer, Richard Holloway spoke. "They are operationally necessary," he said. No one moved. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but the quiet held. Evan looked surprised. Holloway turned a page in front of him and continued without drama. "Buildings fail when leadership confuses labor with replaceability. The highest cost in this business is not payroll. It is blindness. Underinvestment in staff knowledge creates weak systems, avoidable crises, and expensive arrogance." He lifted his eyes toward Evan then, not sharp, not theatrical, just direct enough to make the younger man sit back an inch. "I know this because I made that mistake personally, and this building spent years charging me interest on it." The words settled over the table with more force than volume. Naomi did not look at Holloway immediately. She looked instead at the sunlight touching the edge of the glass water pitcher, at the reflection of hands on polished walnut, at the faces around the room recalibrating in real time. When she finally turned toward him, he gave no performance of humility, no searching look for approval, only a brief nod that seemed to acknowledge not absolution, but memory. Naomi answered Evan herself after that. voice level, precise, all business. She cited retention metrics, training savings, internal promotion efficiency, tenant satisfaction, and emergency response improvements. She did not need moral theater because the numbers were already on her side. By the end of the meeting, the budget line passed without further objection. Afterward, as people filtered out into the corridor with their tablets and unfinished opinions, Richard Holloway lingered by the window. The city behind him shone cold and bright. Naomi gathered her notes, closed her folio, and moved to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Ms. Carter." She turned. He stood with one hand lightly in his pocket, the old posture still there, but emptied now of the superiority it once carried so easily. "That policy," he said, "the executive trainee shadow rotation. I am told some of them resent it." Naomi allowed herself the smallest trace of a smile. "Then it is probably working." Holloway's mouth shifted, not quite into laughter, but close enough to count. He looked out at the city again. "I used to believe respect followed title," he said. "Now I think it follows attention." Naomi studied him for a second, the aging billionaire who once laughed in a marble lobby, because he thought a black cleaning woman existed beneath the line of his concern, and who now stood in a building she owned, speaking in a tone shaped partly by the correction of his own past. "Sometimes," she said, "it follows whoever finally learns to see." Holloway nodded once, accepting the sentence as one accepts weather after years of assuming glass walls can keep it out. Naomi left him there by the window and walked down the corridor toward the elevators. Outside her office, Tasha was waiting with an updated visitor log tucked neatly into a folder. "I corrected the conference arrivals and flagged the changed catering count," she said. Then, catching herself, she took a breath and added without apology, "And I noticed the media team double-booked Suite 28 for Friday, so I called downstairs and fixed it." Naomi looked at the folder, then at the young woman's face, and saw the difference already. Not perfection. Permission. "Good," Naomi said. "That is exactly what you are here to do." Tasha smiled, shoulders easier now, and walked beside her toward the elevator bank, while sunlight spread slowly across the brass trim and polished walls. Around them, the building moved through another day, vents humming, doors opening, footsteps crossing stone, systems holding, because people with names and histories and tired hands had learned how to keep them whole. Naomi pressed the elevator button and waited in the warm band of morning light, listening to the soft mechanical pulse behind the walls. Years ago, she had entered this tower through a service door before dawn, carrying rags, polish, and the weight of other people's assumptions. Now she still came early, still noticed the hidden things, still believed that what was overlooked revealed the truth of a place faster than what was displayed. The difference was that no one could mistake her presence for background anymore. The doors opened with a quiet chime. Naomi stepped forward first, Tasha beside her, and the mirrored interior caught them both for one brief, shining second before the elevator carried them up. That winter, the first snow came before dawn and settled over the city in a silence so complete it seemed to soften even the hard edges of Manhattan. By 5:40 in the morning, Holloway Tower stood wrapped in pale blue light, its glass face catching the faint color of the waking sky, while the sidewalks below held a clean white layer not yet ruined by salt, slush, or impatient shoes. Naomi arrived in a long charcoal coat with snow dusting the shoulders, and paused for 1 second outside the revolving doors, looking at her own reflection in the curved glass. Years had passed. Enough for Gray to touch the world differently. Enough for Grief and Grace to have both made their homes inside her. Lorraine had been gone 18 months now, and there were mornings when Naomi still reached for her phone before remembering that some voices no longer lived at the other end of ordinary habits. But this morning was not hollow. It was full in a quieter way. She stepped into the lobby and felt the familiar warmth meet her, polished stone, soft lighting, the faint scent of evergreen from the winter arrangement near the reception desk, and behind it all the steady hidden breath of a building running properly, because someone had finally decided invisible labor deserved structure, rest, and respect. The night crew was just finishing. A porter rolled a linen cart toward the service hall. Security exchanged low greetings near the east entrance. Tasha, older now and no longer apologizing for competence, stood at the desk in a fitted navy coat, reviewing the holiday vendor log with the ease of someone who had grown into her own authority, one accurate decision at a time. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Miss Carter. Snow plan is already activated. Freight deliveries delayed until 9, and the heating checks on the lower west side are complete." Naomi set her gloves on the marble edge of the desk. "Any issues?" Tasha shook her head. "Only one. The florist sent white roses instead of winter branches for the board luncheon. I told them to correct it." Naomi's mouth softened at the corner. "Good." Tasha slid a folder across the desk. "Also, the scholarship committee finalized the spring selections. 3 employees from maintenance, 1 from security, and 1 custodian from the evening shift who wants to study facilities management." Naomi rested her hand on the folder for a brief second. Even now, after all the years and all the evidence, moments like that still landed in her with quiet force. Not because they were dramatic, because they were the opposite. A small correction made permanent enough to become policy. A ladder where there used to be a wall. She took the folder and headed for the elevator while snowlight brightened the glass doors behind her. On the 40th floor, the board luncheon began with the usual choreography of wealth, dark suits, low voices, linen napkins, silver water pitchers beating lightly under the room's precise climate control. But Naomi had long since stopped mistaking formality for power. She knew where power actually lived now, in budgets, in maintenance schedules, in who got heard before a problem became expensive, in whether the people who kept a place standing were treated as minds or only as hands. She led the meeting efficiently, reviewing year-end occupancy, labor retention, energy reductions, and the measurable performance gains tied directly to staff education and internal promotion. No one challenged those numbers anymore. Not seriously. Success had a way of making old prejudices rephrase themselves into compliments and compliance. Richard Holloway attended again, older now, his movements slower, but his gaze clearer than it had once been. He spoke rarely through most of the meeting, listening with the concentration of someone who had spent years learning that silence could be used for understanding and not only control. When the formal reports were complete and coffee was being refreshed, one of the newer investors, a man from Chicago with a broad smile and the careless confidence of recent money, looked around the table and said, "I have got to admit, this place runs better than half the luxury towers in the city. Whoever built the operational culture here understood that details are everything." The compliment was aimed at the room, but his eyes drifted naturally toward Holloway, following the old mythology still attached to his name. It was a small moment, the kind that used to pass uncorrected. Richard Holloway set down his cup with a soft click on the saucer. "No," he said. The room stilled. He turned slightly toward Naomi, not theatrically, not with any hunger for redemption in public, just with the plainness of a man finally unwilling to let a lie survive convenience. The culture here improved when leadership passed to someone who understood the building long before she was ever allowed to lead it. Snowbright light lay across the table linen. Naomi did not move right away. Around them, glass walls held the pale winter skyline, and in the distance the city looked almost gentle under its white roofs and softened avenues. The investor followed Holloway's gaze, then nodded quickly, embarrassed by the correction and too polished to show it plainly. Naomi answered the moment, the only way she knew that did not cheapen it. "It improved," she said evenly, "because people at every level started being treated like part of the system instead of decoration around it." Richard inclined his head once. "Yes," he said, "that too." After the meeting, the board dispersed into phone calls, drivers, and luncheon schedules. Naomi remained behind for a moment at the window, looking down at the avenue where snowplows had begun their slow orange crawl through the streets. The room smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and the cold mineral scent that sometimes followed people in from winter air. Behind her, Richard approached, but not too close. He had learned distance could be a form of respect. "Your mother would have been proud," he said quietly. Naomi kept her eyes on the city. The sentence entered the room carefully, without ownership, without presumption. She let it rest there for a beat before answering. "She taught me not to wait for the world to become fair before deciding who I was." Richard stood beside the table, hands lightly clasped. "That sounds like wisdom." Naomi turned then, her expression calm. "It sounds like survival," she said. He accepted that without defense. Age had worn many things out of him, but perhaps most importantly, the need to answer every truth with a refinement of his own. After a moment, he said, I spent a great deal of my life confusing polish for character. Naomi looked at the brass trim by the doorway, bright as ever under recessed light. A lot of people do. Richard followed her gaze and gave the smallest breath that almost resembled rueful laughter. You know, he said, for years I thought I built this place. Naomi gathered her papers and slid them into her folio. You financed it, she said. That is not the same thing. He nodded once, slow and unoffended, as if the distinction had become not an insult but a relief. Naomi left him there and took the elevator down alone. The mirrored walls caught her reflection, winter coat over tailored dress, folio at her side, face older now, steadier, shaped by losses and long work, and the kind of joy that no longer needed to announce itself loudly to be real. When the doors opened to the lobby, she could hear the ordinary music of the building moving through another day, the low murmur at reception, the soft roll of luggage wheels, the hidden thrum of vents pushing warm air against the cold outside. Tasha was speaking with a custodian near the service hall, a middle-aged black man in a gray uniform who held a scholarship packet in both hands, as if he was not yet sure whether it belonged to him. His smile was cautious, stunned, almost disbelieving. Naomi did not interrupt. She only watched for one quiet second from across the marble floor and felt the old and the new touch edges inside her. Once, she had stood in a building like this with a rag in her hand and a future folded small enough to fit in a tote bag. Now another person stood under the same warm lights holding his own possible beginning. The difference was not magic. It was choice, policy, attention, correction repeated until it became culture. Naomi walked slowly toward the service corridor, her footsteps softened by the winter runner laid over the marble for wet shoes. As she passed the brass planter near the entrance, she caught her reflection again in its curved, shining surface. Not perfect, not grand, just real. Behind that reflection moved receptionists, porters, executives, cleaners, all of them sharing the same morning under the same roof, no longer arranged by old assumptions quite so easily as before. Outside, snow kept falling in light, patient flakes, whitening the city inch by inch. Inside, the building held steady. Naomi touched the rim of the brass planter with 2 fingers, then continued on, following the warmth and the hum and the living systems behind the walls, her breathing even, her pace unhurried, while the tower she once cleaned rose around her not as a monument to one man's wealth, but as proof that dignity, once protected on purpose, could change the whole shape of a place.